The ground near Avranches did not shake at first. It trembled, subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a held breath before a scream. Then the engines came alive. Steel tracks bit into dirt roads never meant for this weight, this volume, this urgency. Dust rose in choking clouds, coating hedges, villages, men. Radios crackled with overlapping voices, reports colliding, confirmations chasing disbelief. Orders were still being issued when they were already obsolete. It was August 1, 1944. Operation Cobra had succeeded. But success was not what Germany was facing now. They were facing motion. American tanks surged forward not as spearheads but as floods. There was no pause to consolidate, no ceremonial moment of victory. Infantry clung to vehicles as columns stretched beyond sight. Supply trucks raced behind them, drivers gripping steering wheels through exhaustion, adrenaline keeping them upright when sleep no longer could. This was not a breakthrough in the traditional sense. This was a rupture in reality. German forward units tried to respond as trained. They called for confirmation. They requested clarification. They waited for orders. But the enemy did not wait with them. By the time commands arrived, the Americans were already somewhere else. Behind them, beside them, past them. Maps became lies within hours. The German defensive system, built on the assumption of pressure followed by pause, now faced something it had never been designed to stop: uninterrupted speed. Tanks did not stop to secure flanks. Columns did not halt to dress lines. Momentum itself became the doctrine. The war Germany had prepared to fight, the war of lines, reserves, and counterblows, ended that morning in a cloud of diesel smoke and disbelief. And the men who triggered it were already racing away from the moment, leaving behind nothing but confusion and the echo of engines fading east. To understand why this moment was so devastating, one must rewind, not days but decades. Because the shock of August 1st did not come from what happened, but from what everyone believed could happen. For nearly 2 months after D-Day, the war in Normandy had confirmed every German expectation. The land itself fought alongside them. The bocage, thick hedgerows, sunken lanes, cramped fields, turned every advance into a crawl. Tanks burned at close range. Infantry died for yards of ground. Progress was measured in blood, not miles. It looked like 1918 with engines. German commanders watched the Allied advance stall and felt vindicated. This was attrition. This was familiar. This was survivable. Even the Allies seemed trapped in the old logic. Massive firepower applied incrementally, inch by inch. The ghosts of the First World War hovered over Normandy. Every map, every defensive plan, every expectation whispered the same promise: this war would slow. It always did. The Allies themselves feared it. Casualties mounted. Commanders worried Normandy would become another meat grinder. For weeks, the front conformed to Germany's mental model of war: methodical, grinding, predictable. That is why the breakout mattered so much. Germany was not blind. It was trapped inside a worldview reinforced by experience. Everything they had seen since June told them the Allies could not move fast. Not here, not through this terrain, not against prepared defenses. They were right, until suddenly, catastrophically, they were not. Germany did not lose France in 1944 because it failed to plan. It lost because it planned perfectly, for the wrong war. Fortress Europe was not a slogan. It was a philosophy. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, obstacles layered with mathematical precision. The Atlantic Wall stretched across the coast as a statement of permanence. The enemy may land, but he will not pass. Behind it lay the real defense: time. German doctrine assumed that any Allied landing would be slow, cautious, and logistically fragile. The invader would be bled, delayed, forced to pause. Only then would Panzer Reserve strike, decisively, surgically, restoring balance. This belief shaped everything. Command structures centralized authority. Flexibility was discouraged. Initiative was dangerous. Retreat was weakness. Defense was something you held, not something you adapted. Even as the Atlantic Wall cracked, German leadership believed the real battle had not yet begun. Normandy was not the war, it was the prelude. The decisive moment would come when the Allies exhausted themselves against resistance. What they failed to grasp was that the Allies, under a new operational mindset, were no longer fighting for lines or positions. They were fighting for time. And Germany's entire defensive doctrine assumed time was something the defender controlled. That assumption would soon prove fatal. Long before France began to fall beneath his tracks, Patton was already at war with time itself. Patton did not think like most generals of his age. Where others saw fronts and phases, he saw motion and opportunity. His military imagination was shaped less by the trenches of 1918 than by the sweeping campaigns of antiquity. He read Hannibal crossing the Alps not as legend, but as instruction. He studied Napoleon not for glory but for tempo. War, to Patton, was not about holding, it was about arriving first, everywhere all the time. This obsession had cost him dearly. In Sicily, after the slapping incidents, Patton's career seemed finished. Publicly humiliated, sidelined, stripped of command, he was sent into what felt like exile. Many believed his brilliance had finally collided with his volatility and lost. But in that forced stillness, Patton refined his ideas. He wrote obsessively. He replayed campaigns in his mind. He became convinced that modern war had reached a turning point, that engines and radios had finally liberated armies from the gravity of the front line. The general who could exploit this freedom would not just defeat enemies, he would paralyze them. Patton believed that confusion killed faster than bullets, that an enemy unsure of where you were could not fight you. And above all, he believed that hesitation was the deadliest sin a commander could commit. When Third Army was finally activated in late July 1944, Patton did not see it as redemption. He saw it as release. Speed is never an accident. It is built, deliberately, obsessively at every level. The U.S. Third Army was not simply fast because Patton demanded it. It was fast because thousands of officers, engineers, mechanics, and drivers had designed it to move like nothing else on the battlefield. Supply officers rewrote priorities. Fuel was treated as ammunition. Trucks were rerouted mid-drive. Convoys ran day and night, headlights dimmed, drivers swapping seats without stopping. Patton encouraged decentralization in a war that still feared it. Battalion commanders were expected to act, not ask. Reconnaissance units were told to push until stopped, then push again somewhere else. The phrase "march or die" was not rhetoric, it was policy. The miracle was logistical. Every mile gained increased consumption. Every hour saved multiplied demand. Yet somehow fuel appeared where it was needed. Ammunition followed armor. Broken vehicles were abandoned without ceremony. The army did not slow to fix itself, it shed weight and kept moving. This was an army trained to accept imperfection in exchange for momentum. German doctrine prized control. Third Army prized velocity. When the order came to advance, the machine did not creak into motion. It exploded forward. When Patton's columns poured through Avranches, it did not feel like an advance. It felt like release. Armor surged through the gap left by Operation Cobra as if a dam had shattered. Roads clogged instantly, not with traffic but with movement. Units leapfrogged one another, engines overheating, crews half-blind with dust and exhaustion. Towns were entered, bypassed, forgotten, rediscovered hours later by units that had never been told they were liberated. Within the first 72 hours, the impossible became routine. German commanders awoke to reports that Americans were already behind them. Not probing. Not infiltrating. Occupying crossroads, cutting rail lines, overrunning headquarters that still believed the front lay miles away. Entire German formations dissolved not in battle but in confusion. Orders demanded counterattacks against enemies no longer there. Reserves were committed toward threats that had already shifted direction. The battlefield no longer had a center, only motion. Patton did not pause to celebrate. He did not consolidate gains. Every instinct told him that stopping would be fatal, not because the enemy would strike but because momentum would die. And momentum, once lost, could never be fully recovered. Germany had prepared for pressure. What it faced instead was acceleration. At German headquarters, reality began to fracture. Reports arrived that made no sense. American units were being spotted far beyond expected positions, 50 miles, sometimes more. Entire divisions appeared to have slipped through solid defensive zones without fighting. Intelligence officers marked locations on maps, erased them, then marked them again somewhere else entirely. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge stared at situation boards that no longer reflected a battlefield, but a hallucination. The Americans were not advancing in lines. They were appearing. One town fell. Then another. Then a third, somehow behind the second. The German command system had been built to manage pressure, not velocity. It required confirmation, hierarchy, approval. But speed annihilated that structure. Orders issued at dawn were meaningless by noon. Counterattacks assembled too late, striking empty ground while American armor roared elsewhere. Officers began to speak in language usually reserved for disasters. We have lost the front. There is no rear. We no longer know where the enemy is. Speed was no longer just a tactical advantage, it was psychological warfare. German commanders were not being outmaneuvered. They were being disoriented. The war they understood had vanished, replaced by one that obeyed no familiar rules. The illusion of control, the belief that war could still be shaped through doctrine and discipline, collapsed under the weight of motion. Germany had prepared to fight an army. It was now trying to chase a phenomenon. France did not fall so much as it slipped away. Cities became footnotes. Le Mans, Orléans, Chartres, names that once demanded battles were now passed through in hours. Sometimes minutes. Liberation outran celebration. Civilians waved as columns thundered past, unsure whether the Americans were arriving or already leaving. Maps struggled to keep up. Dates blurred together. Advances once measured in miles per week were now measured in miles per hour. The Seine loomed, then vanished behind armored columns that crossed before German forces could even organize its defense. This was not a campaign paced by objectives. It was paced by fuel gauges and human endurance. Crews drove until their hands shook. Officers slept in moving vehicles. Reconnaissance units pushed forward until they collided with something solid, then simply flowed around it. For German forces, the experience bordered on the surreal. Units were ordered to defend cities already lost. Others were told to counterattack enemies who had vanished into the distance. The Americans did not destroy resistance everywhere. They rendered it irrelevant. Speed compressed time itself. Days of decision-making were crushed into hours. Weeks of planning were erased by a single night's movement. The battlefield no longer belonged to the side with better defenses, but to the side that could move faster than thought. And Patton's army was thinking in miles. Faced with chaos, Germany reverted to instinct. From his headquarters, Adolf Hitler issued orders that reflected an older war, a war where resolve could still bend reality. He demanded a counterattack westward toward Avranches. The objective was simple and catastrophically outdated: cut off the American spearhead and restore the front. The result was mortine. German units, already exhausted and disorganized, were thrown into an attack against an enemy that was not concentrating, but dispersing. The Americans did not meet the blow head-on. They absorbed it, flowed around it, and let speed do the rest. The counterattack failed almost as soon as it began. German forces bled themselves against air power, artillery, and units that seemed to materialize wherever resistance formed. The attempt to restore order only deepened the chaos. In trying to fight yesterday's war, Germany sealed tomorrow's defeat. Mortine did not stop Patton. It set the stage for annihilation. Speed, once unleashed, does not merely outrun enemies. It surrounds them. As Patton's forces wheeled north and Allied armies pressed south, the battlefield began to fold inward. What had once been a retreat corridor narrowed into a funnel. Then a trap. German units poured into it, hoping to escape, only to find the exits shrinking by the hour. This was the birth of the Falaise pocket. Roads clogged with vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel. Horses lay beside trucks. Artillery pieces jammed together in hopeless knots. The sky filled with smoke and the sound of engines no longer running. Inside the pocket, German soldiers realized the truth too late. They were not fighting an advancing enemy. They were fighting time, and time had already run out. Speed had closed the jaws, and there would be no escape. Inside the Falaise pocket, war lost all abstraction. For German soldiers there was no longer a front, only directionless movement under constant threat. Columns advanced by instinct, not orders. Units merged, fractured, vanished. Men who had trained for years to fight in disciplined formations now moved as individuals, clinging to any path that seemed to lead away from annihilation. The air was thick with smoke and dust. Vehicles burned where they stalled. Horses collapsed beside abandoned guns. The roads were so crowded with wreckage that even retreat became impossible. Artillery fire fell without warning. Allied aircraft prowled overhead, striking anything that moved, then circling back to strike again. 4 American tank crews advancing toward the pocket. Exhaustion was absolute. Many had not slept properly in days. They drove until their hands cramped around the controls, until their eyes burned from dust and diesel fumes. There was no sense of triumph, only momentum and obligation. Orders were simple: keep moving, keep pressure, do not let the enemy reorganize. Some crews later struggled to remember individual days. The advance blurred into a single, continuous experience. Noise, motion, fear, and the constant knowledge that stopping meant giving the enemy time. And time, Patton had taught them, was the most dangerous gift of all. Speed had stripped war down to its rawest form. Survival was no longer about bravery or doctrine but endurance, physical, mental, and moral. When the pocket finally collapsed, what remained was devastation on a scale few Allied soldiers had ever witnessed. The roads around Falaise were choked with the remnants of an army. Destroyed vehicles lay axle to axle for miles. Corpses filled ditches, fields, and forests. The smell lingered, an inescapable mixture of fuel, decay, and burned metal that hung in the air long after the fighting ended. Eyewitnesses struggled to describe it. Some said it was impossible to walk without stepping on bodies. Others recalled the silence after the guns stopped, a silence made heavier by the knowledge of what it contained. This was not a battlefield frozen in time. It was a place still dying. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were dead or captured. Not because they had fought poorly, but because they had been overtaken by a war moving faster than any army could endure. The destruction was not the result of a single decisive engagement. It was the cumulative cost of being too slow to escape. For the Allies, victory carried a bitter weight. Speed had won, but at a human cost that left no room for celebration. The road east lay open, yet many who stood among the wreckage understood they were witnessing not just a defeat, but an extinction of an entire way of fighting war. Then, abruptly, the motion faltered. Patton's army had outrun not only the enemy, but its own lifeline. Tanks rolled to a stop not under fire but in silence, fuel gauges empty. The very speed that had shattered Germany's defenses now threatened to undo its own success. Third Army was hundreds of miles ahead of schedule. Supply plans designed for a slower advance could not keep pace. Trucks raced along improvised routes, engines straining, drivers collapsing at the wheel. Every gallon became precious. Every delay felt catastrophic. The solution was a logistical gamble, the Red Ball Express, a non-stop convoy system designed to feed the hunger of speed. Thousands of vehicles poured onto French roads, racing against time to deliver fuel, ammunition, and food to an army that refused to wait. But even this effort could not fully close the gap. Patton fumed as orders arrived limiting his advance. To him, stopping was not a pause, it was surrendering initiative. He believed the war could be ended if momentum were maintained just a little longer. Instead, the engines went quiet. Speed had carried the Allies to the edge of decisive victory. Now it revealed its price. An army can move faster than its enemy, but not faster than its supply lines. The hurricane had reached the limits of its force. The border was visible and unreachable. By early September, Patton's forward elements stood within striking distance of Germany itself. Beyond the Moselle lay the homeland, the symbolic threshold of the war's end. For Patton, the sight was agonizing. He believed, fiercely, sincerely, that the enemy was finished. One more surge, one more uninterrupted drive, and the war could collapse under its own weight. But the engines were silent. Fuel shortages turned movement into waiting. Tanks sat idle, crews staring across rivers and ridgelines they could not cross. Metz, stubborn and fortified, resisted just enough to compound the frustration. What had once been unstoppable momentum now bled away in hours and days of immobility. Patton raged, not theatrically but philosophically. To him, the pause was not merely logistical, it was existential. Speed had been his weapon, his proof. Now the war was reverting to form, lines, sieges, attrition, exactly the conditions Germany understood best. The ghost of speed haunted every stalled vehicle. The sense that something irreversible had been lost settled over the army like fog. Time once stolen had been returned. Germany used it ruthlessly. The pause allowed shattered units to regroup, defenses to be rebuilt, and doctrine to reassert itself. Along the Siegfried Line, concrete and steel once again promised delay. Command structure stabilized. Communications recovered. The shock faded into grim resolve. Most critically, the Germans planned their counterstroke. What Patton's speed had denied them, preparation, it now restored. The coming winter would not find them surprised again. For the Allies, the cost of the pause became clear months later in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was not born of German strength alone, but of time to plan, to concentrate, to gamble. Speed had nearly ended the war. Its absence prolonged it. From a strategic distance, August 1944 marked a rupture in military thought. Patton's campaign demonstrated that speed was not an accessory to combat, it was combat. Tempo disrupted command. Motion destroyed coherence. Reconnaissance pulled forces forward rather than orders pushing them. Initiative flowed downward, not up. Static defense, once the pinnacle of military engineering, was exposed as brittle. Against an enemy that refused to pause, fortifications became irrelevant. Against velocity, control collapsed. Military historians would later recognize the campaign as a turning point in operational art. What mattered was not mass alone but timing, not position but momentum. Speed did not guarantee victory, but it made defense obsolete. Years later, veterans struggled to explain what it felt like. American tankers spoke of motion without memory, of days blending into nights, of sleeping with engines idling, of fear managed only by forward movement. German survivors described something stranger, fighting an enemy they could not find, retreating from a presence that felt omnipresent. Reunions softened the edges of memory. Enemies spoke not of hatred, but of disorientation, of maps that lied, of orders that arrived too late, of how speed did not just defeat units, it shattered certainty. War, they agreed, had changed them. Not because of what they saw, but because of how fast it all happened. The irony was complete. Germany had pioneered blitzkrieg in 1940, movement over mass, speed over strength. But innovation, once victorious, had hardened into doctrine. By 1944, the revolutionaries had become guardians of orthodoxy. They prepared for siege. They faced a hurricane. History punished the failure to adapt with merciless symmetry. The lessons endured. Decades later, armored columns in the desert would swing wide and deep, collapsing enemy defenses through tempo rather than attrition. Analysts traced the lineage back to Normandy, to August, to the moment speed proved decisive. The famous left hook of Operation Desert Storm echoed Patton's belief: arrive faster than the enemy can understand. Technology evolved. Doctrine shifted. But the principle remained. Speed compresses decision-making until mistakes become inevitable.